What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and today we're going to be going over reloading, fire rates, switching weapons, changing the mesh of the weapon and where it gets attached to, fixing the attach points for our weapons based on what we have equipped and what we have obtained, because they're different. You can have a weapon in your inventory and you might not have it as your active weapon. So we're going to be fixing all these things up today just to make a much smoother experience for our game. And this is because I want to start getting into dealing damage to enemies. I mean, we had the initial episode where we made this little dummy, and it does technically have like a small hitbox down here somewhere where I can hit it and deal damage. However, I want to really start defining what we want bullets and projectiles to do in this game, as well as how they reflect off surfaces if we want that sort of thing. And to do that, I really want an enemy to test with, even if it's just a dummy. But there's no point in doing all that when we still have pretty major bugs in our system. So we're going to go through today and we're going to fix up a ton of issues. That way we're ready to continue with the series next time. And plus, no longer should we have to try and fix up any of these things that are left over. We're going to knock them all out in one go. All the ones that were introduced by us and not from the engine itself. All right. So first things first, let's go into the code. So this is the FPS tutorial character, or basically our base character. And before we actually get started, if you would like to catch up on the series, we're getting pretty far along, episode 23 or so. And at this point, we have a pretty nice looking demo here. After today, it's going to be much smoother. And if you want to kind of catch up with everything we've done, then I'll leave this icon in the top right corner for you to get caught up. Otherwise, let's get started on smoothing everything out. All right, so first things first, let's take a quick look at how our on fire function was working. So, on fire, you know, it's a first-person shooter. It's one of the most important things we can do is getting our shooting logic correct. If you noticed before, you may have noticed this when playing. If not, if you have an automatic weapon or a weapon that we have set to automatic and you keep clicking, or you click and release and then click again before the timer runs out, you'll notice that the bullets will actually start shooting out more and more rapidly, not only in your ammo counter in the bottom right, but also just as you're seeing the projectiles spawn, you'll see them shoot more and more rapidly. This is because we were clearing, or we were invalidating the timer correctly, but because this timer is a repeating timer, then it was causing issues depending on when we would click this, and we would never clear the timer. We want to make sure we clear the timer when we do certain things, such as either, you know, reload or release the trigger and different things like that, because we don't want the timer to still go, and then we still have the ability to continue to shoot. That's where these issues are coming from. And so if we look at the code, I'll go through it pretty quickly because there haven't been any major changes in this function. In fact, there haven't been any changes in this function, except for this, where we don't allow ourselves to shoot while we're reloading. But let me explain this so that you guys that you can understand what's going on. So here we have it to where we check and make sure that the weapon that we were trying to shoot is a valid index, and basically it's a valid weapon in our weapons array. So we're not trying to shoot a weapon that we don't have, just in case we ever got into a position where that was possible. We don't want that to be the case. Then we determine, we call fire on the weapon itself, because regardless at this point we want to shoot the weapon. We have ammo in our clip, and that's enough for us to want to be able to fire. However, determining what happens when we fire is where the issue was coming in. So we were checking if this was an automatic weapon, and then we were setting a timer using this fire timer handle and giving it this fire rate, which is the weapon's fire rate, and we set this boolean to be true. That boolean at the end of set timer there is if it's a repeating timer or not. So basically, if this can keep going after the timer is up, and if it can start over and start the process again. And yes, we do want that. I remember what I said earlier, if we have issues where, you know, the timer's still going and we start a new timer, or we reactivate the timer, that's when we get those issues that you see, where you can shoot more than the allotted number of bullets. You actually kind of have like, the timer handle has multiple instances of the timer on it. So, the way to fix this is pretty simple actually. Basically, anywhere where we want to, perform this fix where we only want to shoot the automatic weapon when we're holding the trigger, regardless if it's automatic or not, we still, if we release the trigger, we still want to stop it. So in the past, we were invalidating the timer handle here. We actually don't want to do that. We don't want to invalidate the timer handle anymore. Invalidating it allows us to start it up again quicker. I was actually understanding it incorrectly when used with the repeating timer. And so it was invalidating the timer. We were starting the timer up again more quickly, and then it was firing more bullets at a faster interval. So you can get rid of this fire timer invalidate in the stop firing function. Stop firing is called when you release the fire button. Now, the other thing we want to do is fix up our reloading a bit. So I mentioned a few minutes ago in On Fire, we now have this check to say if not is reloading. And this is because we could actually shoot while we were reloading, which of course is a little bit silly. And so the fix for it is pretty simple. But I also want to introduce something else that will help us down the road. So we have two types of reloading. So we have manual reloading, and that's what happens when the player presses the button to trigger the character to reload the weapon. There is also what I call automatic reloading, which is if the character is shooting their weapon and the player tries to fire when they no longer have any bullets in their clip or their mag or whatever we want to call it, then we automatically say, okay, the player is out. They realize they're out. Let's reload for them. They don't have to press the reload button. They can just press the shoot button if they have no ammo and reload. Internally, they're essentially the same thing, but they are handled a bit differently on our side. And so this is reloading boolean we had and we were using to play animations with. All right, let's take a look at this and how we were using it. We were using it slightly incorrectly for our cases. So where this comment is where we were setting is reloading to be true, which means if the player pressed the reload button, it would call this function, manual reload. It would set is reloading to be true as long as they actually had a weapon they could reload. And then it would call reload weapon. Well, that doesn't really make a lot of sense because regardless if it's a manual reload or an automatic reload, the character should still play the reloading animation, and we still want to do things like stop firing from occurring while we're reloading. So really, this doesn't make too much sense. What I've done is I've taken out is reloading and manual reload. You can leave it as a separate function like this. This can be manual reload, and this is reload weapon. But we actually want to set is reloading to be true in here instead. You could technically go one step farther and only do it if there is ammo left from the calculate ammo function, which we made a long time ago. However, that's up to you. It could be useful to set it prior to that function because it could be you trying to reload and then you determine you don't have enough ammo. For something like a shotgun, when you're putting in individual shells, you can actually use an anim montage to determine how many times you're going to have to load that type of ammunition. And so it's a little bit down the road. However, it could be useful to leave it like this. I'm going to leave it like this for now, and we'll see exactly the best way to approach it as we get there. Okay? And it probably goes without saying since I started it by saying this, but make sure that you do check that you are not reloading. Exclamation mark is reloading, meaning not reloading before firing the weapon. We don't want to be able to fire while we're reloading. All right, next thing we want to fix. We want to fix the issue where changing our weapon no longer works as intended. And so we switched around how our inventory worked quite a few episodes ago now. And in just the last few episodes, we switched how the mesh was attached to our character. Now, that's working fine. We don't have to change that. But the problem is when we switch our weapon now, our weapon is still being interacted with by the character that is holding it. And what I mean by that, if we go into the engine and you can go into base weapon BP just to see it in the viewport, you can see that it has this interaction box. I call it the pickup collider. And what this basically means is if you're within this radius, if you're colliding with this invisible box, then at this point you have the ability to interact with the weapon. So in terms of our game, it means you can pick it up off the ground, you can use it to switch with your own weapon, and different things like that. So logically, that makes sense. But an issue that we had with our new system, since we're using basically what weapon we're interacting with to determine which weapon to attach to our character, technically, if you had more than one weapon in your inventory, then these interaction boxes, these colliders, were actually still active. And because of that, you were able to get the wrong socket when changing weapons, because it kind of depended on which weapon collider you were triggering first and which one was firing first. So basically, you could have your gun the complete wrong way. Your gun would be sideways. So if you ever switch weapons, either by picking it up or literally switching guns, you could see that maybe you only saw your hands or you saw the gun at a completely wrong angle. And this is because both these colliders are still active, and so our old logic doesn't really work as well as we'd like here. So the way to fix that is we're going to disable this box collider when it is in a state of being equipped. We don't have to deal with it anymore. For now, all we have to do is disable the collision box entirely. We will want to re-enable it if it ever becomes, not picked up or not under possession of a player in the future. But for now, let's go into our base character BP, whatever your base blueprint character is, or character blueprint is. And let's take a look at our logic here. So the way our logic was working is we press an input action interact, which, just to remind you and show you what mine is, I have interact as E. And so if I press interact, we determine if there's an interaction actor. The interaction actor gets set when we are overlapping one or more actors that have a collision box, so such as this pickup collider. We cast to make sure, this is a base weapon BP is the actor that we can interact with. If so, we set the weapon to be obtained, and then we were adding it to our weapons array, and that was good. However, you can see now I've added something else in between here. Off of the cast to base weapon BP, I've gotten the pickup collider, which is our box collider component, right here, whatever this is on yours. And I brought off of that, and I set collision response to channel. And in this case, you could actually do to all channels. So you do set collision, if I could spell, response to all channels. And what this means is it will set whatever we put here as the response to each type of collision that it could get. So if it collides with a pawn, a character, a vehicle, or whatever other collision settings you have. And if you're not sure, when you click on an object that can have collision, if you look at the details panel and scroll down, you have this section that says collision. Now, these have collision presets for ignore, overlap, and block. You can also make it custom and put in your own logic. When we set collision response to all channels to be ignore, like we're doing right here, that means that it won't even respect any of these other collisions. If this pickup collider collides with anything, it's going to ignore the response, meaning that we're not going to do anything with it. And that's what we want, because once we already have the weapon equipped, we no longer need the pickup collider. Then we still do the same logic we were doing before, which is where we add that weapon to our array of weapons, which is accurate. I make sure it's a valid and unique reference, and then I do a branch. And before, we were calling switch to next primary weapon, just like we are now. But I've added something else here, you can tell. And this is because we had another bug. So right there, what we did with the pickup collider is that fixes the weird attachment issues with where the weapon will be attached once you switch to it. Or really, in this case, once you pick it up. However, we had another bug where if you were to pick up a weapon, my goal initially was that you would pick up a weapon and it would switch to that weapon. It would be, this is the weapon I picked up, so I'm assuming I want to use it now. Well, we had that working, and then we switched around our inventory logic to where we could hold as many weapons as we want by using this weapons array. And so that had broken, and we never revisited it. So what I want to do is I want to determine if we're switching to next primary weapon based off of the player's input, or if the game is forcing the character to switch to that weapon. This is important because this first-person shooter tutorial series can work for, my intention is for it to work with any type of game. So I like to use Doom as an example because I think it's a well-made first-person shooter that has a lot of good mechanics we can take from. However, I also like the multiplayer aspect, so I like to think of things like Halo, Apex Legends, Titanfall, all these different types of games that I see a lot of different mechanics from that I enjoy, and again, I can take from. So, I want to have the ability to force the character to switch to a certain weapon. Say you pick up a new weapon for the first time. Like in Doom, if you pick up the shotgun for the first time, Doom Slayer or Doom Guy, he picks up the weapon and he inspects it. Now, we don't have to do that, but my point is, he inspects it and then he uses that weapon. This is one way we could force the character to go to that weapon. In multiplayer games, say I am playing Apex Legends or Halo, and I switch with a weapon that is on the ground or at its spawn. We actually want to force to that weapon. We want to force switch. Doesn't matter what weapon you had out prior. The weapon we just swapped with should now be our equipped weapon. So, I've changed the switch to next primary weapon function up a bit. We had this in the past, and I've added an integer called force switch index. What this is going to do is going to determine if this is a weapon that we want to switch to directly and right now, as opposed to just going in order of the weapons that we acquired them. Then we are going to pass in the index and use that as the weapon that we currently have equipped. So, long story short, if we go into our code and go to our FPS tutorial character.h, scroll down to your switch to next primary weapon function. Right here. Okay? Before, this did not have any parameters. I've now added an integer, force switch index, and I've set it equal to -1 by default. This is called an optional parameter, and what I'm doing here is I'm having this function take in an integer that is optional, meaning if we don't give it one, it will be whatever value we set it equal to. So I set it equal to -1 here. -1 in coding and in general usually is an indicator to say we haven't found what we're looking for or no argument was passed in. So -1 here is saying we just want to switch to the next one available. We don't have to force to any specific index. So if we don't pass an index along, then we'll just continue the logic as necessary. Our logic for switching weapons is good. We just want to be able to switch to a specific weapon sometimes. So instead of making a new function, I just have this optional variable. And then if you go back into the CPP and scroll down to that function, switch to next primary weapon. Okay, so switch to next primary weapon. Now I've added an integer, and when you're in the CPP file, you don't have to give it a default value. You can just use integer for switch index. It knows that it's an optional variable at this point. But regardless, add your integer here, okay? And then you can see what I do here. So I do two new things here. First new thing that I do is I clear our fire timer handle. Because before, when we were switching weapons, just like what the stuff that we did with the timer earlier, if you were pressing it too quickly, you could actually get it to shoot more than once because you didn't validate the old timer and start a new one. Well, this is the opposite issue. So this one is the timer would run out, but we never cleared the timer. So it would still be trying to perform the logic of the old timer. So when you would switch weapons, say you're now on a pistol, and it would still be shooting automatically. We don't want that either. So when we switch weapons, regardless of how quick or slow the swap is, and if the player release buttons or not, we want to clear the timer here, because if you're shooting and you switch weapons and you're holding the trigger, you can also still be triggering the timer. So there's a lot of edge cases here where you can do multiple actions at once that cause an issue. So when we switch to our next weapon, we want to make sure that we're clearing the timer. Okay, that's what this does. Now, the other thing that I added was I had all this logic in here before. All of this logic right here that is highlighted is what was in switch to next primary weapon. I've put all of that inside of an else statement, and I've added an if above it. I basically just check if force switch index is greater than -1. So we know that in an array, our indices are only ever going to be positive. And so if it's greater than -1, and positive or 0, I should say. So if it's greater than -1, I know that it is going to be within the bounds of an array, or rather, I can expect that it should be within the bounds of an array. You can add a check here to see if it's actually in the array or not. However, we do a bunch of checks for this one, adding it and things like that. So it should be okay. If it is greater than -1, I'm saying, okay, that means we've passed in a value and we know that we want to swap to this weapon as soon as we pick it up. So to do that, all I do is I set our weapon index. Remember, this is the tracker for what weapon we're currently holding, just in case you're in a situation where your game, you can hold more than 2 weapons at a time. Again, that's kind of the intention here for this tutorial series, is you can hold as many as you want and swap between them. So I set weapon index equal to the force switch index. And then I just call switch weapon. Switch weapon is the one in Blueprint that actually triggers, changing of the item that is attached and those sort of things. Now, you're going to notice something different here, though. Since we added a parameter to a function that we were calling through the setup player input component function. So in here. Since we added this function, since we added a parameter to this function, without passing anything in, you'll actually get an error here because you can't bind an action to call a function and pass it a parameter without doing other things. You can technically make it work. However, in my opinion, it's not really worth it a lot of the time. It's quite a bit of extra work when really you could just call a separate function and separate the logic. So in this case, what I've done is I've made another function called trigger weapon switch. So you can see right here, this is my new function. And I specify that this was requested by the player because, again, this is an input that the player presses, and they say, yes, I want to switch weapons. That can be different than being forced to swap to a weapon when you interact with, something on the ground, when you're done with a cutscene. Maybe the character pulls out a weapon at the end of a cutscene, and the game is meant to mimic that. So at the end of the cutscene, your character is standing there with that weapon out. So they can be totally independent. It doesn't have to have the player have any interaction at all. So I made this new function, and instead of using switch to next primary weapon, switch primary, which is just my switch weapon input, I call this new function trigger weapon switch instead. Once you do that, go down and make this function somewhere. I put it right next to all these other weapon switch functions. And all I do currently is call switch to next primary weapon, but you'll notice that I don't pass it an integer. Remember, it's optional. So me not passing it makes it -1. And because of that, it's not greater than -1. So it goes into the else and goes and does all the regular logic we are used to when dealing with switching weapons. All right. And now that fixes the problem that we were having where we could not switch to... We want to automatically swap to the weapon that we're picking up or interacting with when that was my intention. So that fixes that, because if you look back in the blueprint, we now pass when we add this element to the weapons array, it gives you the index that it was added to. So I use that after making sure it's not equal to -1, just as a safety check, and I pass that into the force switch index here. Because this is not really a manual switch weapon call, but rather this is a interact with something call. All right. Now, there's one other thing we have to do, and this is how we're going to fix up our actual attaching issues. We fixed where they're attached now and what weapon is being attached, but we also have to make sure that they are attaching at the right point based off of the weapon index, because before we were using the interaction actor, which you'll notice now that we set the pickup collider to ignore all, we won't always have an interaction actor. Interaction actor, literally the intention of it is that when you are right here, when the equip text message is up, so basically once you're colliding with its pickup collider, then it will set that to be the interaction actor so that it knows what item is going to be added to your inventory. However, we're no longer going to have that because we're setting the response to be ignore, So if I pick up a weapon, right? If I pick up a weapon and I leave, and now my weapons ignore the response. So I would have no interaction actor here. It would actually be null pointer or invalid. And it would actually crash or just basically give me an error and it wouldn't let me switch weapons, or not to the correct weapon anyway. Not until I walked over one. So it could work sometimes in the past, but we're going to make it work all the time. So if you look at event switch weapon, it's the same logic as we had in the past, where we call detach current weapon because we want to get rid of the weapon we're holding, and we do a switch on the weapon type that comes out of this event. We also have the same attach actor to component that we had in the past with the same sockets and the same settings. The only thing that's changed is that instead of using the interaction actor and the mesh, we're going to use the weapons array at the weapon index and use the mesh. So quite literally, you type weapons and get weapons, drag off of this and get a copy, and then you can click and type weapon index, drag this into the get, and then this right here, this will return a base weapon object. And that's what we care about. That's what we're trying to equip here. So we don't need the interaction actor, but we actually need the base weapon that we're going to be equipping. And this is good too because it has a reference to the actual weapon. So at any point, as long as that's in our inventory and we can get that through the array, then we can access this weapon. You pass that in as the target for all three of these. You can see I'm doing that here, up here, down here, and down here. And then the mesh that we were using before, that's our character mesh. It still gets passed into the parent for all of these. Okay. And now that fixes the issue where no matter if we were interacting or being able to collide with an actor or not, we can still attach the weapon where it needs to go when switching the weapon. So you can see that we can now, if we just recap everything, we can shoot our single fire weapons as much as we want, and we can't shoot while we're reloading. You can probably hear me clicking the mouse. We can pick up another gun. This is burst fire. Shoot. Shoots 3 bullets at a time. Reload. Still can't shoot while we're reloading. I can switch weapons and go back to the previous weapon that I had. Again, that was already working. Okay. We can also switch to another weapon and have that weapon attached to our character correctly, no matter what. We can press shoot and release shoot on automatic weapons as much as we want, and it will still fire at the correct rate. We can also shoot, change weapons, and shoot normal. Shoot the normal fire rate, not a different fire rate because of a previous weapon that we had equipped. You can also equip other versions of the same weapon. Like in this case, I actually have a different blaster. So I have 2 blasters in my inventory. Okay, and you can tell which one's different because the one has the press E to equip blaster prompt, and it has that because I've actually started the character out with this weapon as opposed to picking it up, so we never ignored the collision channel. And so the best way to handle that is if we go into our base character BP, and if you go into the event graph, we are adding a weapon at the start and attaching it to our weapon socket. We're adding the blaster. Now, we don't have to do this. We could force the character to pick up a weapon. So that would be one solution. The other solution is pretty simple as well. If you actually just drag all this stuff over and drag off of this and get the pickup collider, just like we were doing for the weapons we equip. It's going to be a little bit ugly, so I'm actually going to modify this quickly for you. It looks a little bit better. And just set this collision response to channels. So set collision response to all channels. Something like that. And I'll bring this down just so that it's not in the way. Drag this through. And we're going to ignore it for all channels. Now you'll be able to see that the blaster that we have equipped by default does not say press E to equip blaster, because it's ignoring that pickup collider. And so you can see how useful that is. But I can also hold multiple instances of different weapons, okay? And this is important because before, the way we were doing it with the interaction actor, you couldn't actually hold different weapons unless you were standing on that type of weapon to pick it up. So you can see this one has 12 bullets in it. When I switch weapons, this one only has 5. This is particularly useful. So if you can switch with weapons that other players have on the ground or things like that. And yeah, so we fixed up all those issues in today's episode, guys. In the next episode, we're going to be fixing up the collision. And I say fixing up, but really implementing the collision between our projectiles and the enemy. We do have damage working with the enemy on a very, very mild level, where we have this tiny little box we could actually hit to sometimes deal damage. What we should do is set up our own events for when a collision occurs with our projectile, our bullet, and then do the proper logic. And that's what we're going to be covering in the next episode. We'll also be going over some very, very basic AI, just probably walking around just so we can hit a moving target and see some of the effects on that, because we don't really want to push our enemies back when we shoot them. Or maybe we do, but, you know, we probably don't want it to look like this. We maybe want them to be launched backward or something, as opposed to just like knocked back due to the sheer collision of the object. So anyway, guys, that's all I got for you today. Thank you so much for watching. I can't wait to see what we do in the next few episodes. I'm going to give a huge, huge shout out to my YouTube membership and Patreon supporters and subscribers. Thank you guys so much for taking the time to support me and just keep me going. I really, really appreciate it. I love this series, and I love you guys. Thank you. If you had any issues with this tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community. I'll be happy to help you out for free. Alright, as I said, that's all I got, so thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.